after the Internet revolution. That is to say, we live in an age after a revolution that was supposed to, like everything, like every revolution, was supposed to have changed everything. Obviously, it's changed how we consume information, how we look for things, how we think about things. But today I want to talk about something else that the Internet was supposed to change forever. The Internet was supposed to change the way capitalism works. It was supposed to change our world into a paradise imagined by Adam Smith, where competition never ends, where every large firm is subject to be destroyed by a startup, the next new thing. In a world where we can expect a constant cycle of new companies, new ideas, and no restrictions, no monopolies, none of the great powers of the industrial age. The question is, if that's true, why is it when we look carefully at the Internet markets, we look at the market for music downloads, dominated by a single firm, Apple Computers. When we look at social networking sites, there was some competition. Now Facebook is by far and away the leading entity and shows no sign of weakening. And perhaps the most obvious example in our age are the market share in the world of search queries. Google here has 80%, more than 80% of search queries, has no signs of losing market share despite determined challenges by other companies. Well, I'm interested in these questions, and I've spent the last 4 years researching the history of American information empires. Could it be that the Internet, contrary to our expectations, actually creates monopolies? Could it be at a deeper level that Americans, despite our professed love for competition, openness, the virtues of deregulation and decentralization, that in our hearts we have a love for monopoly, that we create these things ourselves and will continue to do so? As I've said, I spent the last 4 years looking at the history of the American information industries. And what you see is a tendency, a powerful tendency, for information industries to give birth to powerful monopolies. There are, generally speaking, 5 reasons that information markets or information tends to attract the industrial structure we call monopoly. The first is something that economists call network effects. A telephone that connects 3 people is kind of a fun toy. A telephone that connects 10,000 people becomes useful. A telephone that connects a nation becomes a tool of monopoly. It becomes much more useful the more people use it. And so network effects refers to any product that becomes more useful the more people are using it. And it has been the backbone of the nation's it was the backbone historically of the nation's most powerful monopolist in communications history, AT&T. A company that ruled the telephone markets uncontested for 7 decades. The seconds are economies of scale, which people are familiar with from companies like Standard Oil, John Rockefeller's company. But I tell you that the power of economics of scale is far greater when it comes to information products. Because a single information product, a TV show, a movie, can be watched by millions of people at no extra cost. Once it's created, it can be used for everyone. This is the logic that gave birth to the National Broadcasting Company in the 1920s, when it realized that instead of 100 radio stations making 100 radio programs, it was far more efficient, far more effective to make one much higher quality program for the entire nation. And so information products tend to have a natural affinity for economies of scale. Third, there is a power to the integration of multiple levels of an economy, of an industry that has been taken advantage of over and over in the information markets. The classic example is Hollywood studios, something I study at great length in my new book. What the Hollywood studios realized is that by owning all the theaters, all the distribution networks, all the cameras, studios, and even owning individual directors and actors, that they could make films of the type that no one had ever seen before. Films like this. It's also something that AT&T took advantage of with its integrated phone system that was one policy, one system, and universal service. Finally, there is something about the information industries that seems to attract a certain type of person who has an interest not just in money or in luxury, but a deeper will to power. Joseph Schumpeter, the great innovation economist, prophesied that the men who would run these sorts of empires were not interested in normal things. They were not like normal people. But they were motivated by the dream and the will to found a private kingdom. They wanted to prove themselves superior to others. And there is an abundant opportunity when you run a company that controls information to control the minds of people in the nation. Not to control, but to influence. You have a kind of power that is deeply alluring to the kind of men who build empires. And so when we look at the early days of AT&T, we see this man, Theodore Vail. His biographer said of him, he always had a taste for conquest. He could do nothing in a small way. Thomas Edison said of him, Mr. Vail was a big man. His vision, his dream, was to unite all of American communications in a giant monopoly. He did it and gave us the AT&T empire, which lasted 70 years. Here's David Sarnoff, the founder of NBC, who was, as one commentator put it, a genius in the art of industrial combat. And there are many, many other examples. The power over information has always been so alluring, not just to American businessmen, that it has always attracted people who are fetishists of power. The greatest example of the totalitarian regimes of the 1930s, and what is so interesting is that they copied American industrial structure. They copied the structure of Ford Motors when Joseph Goebbels set up the spiritual weapon of the totalitarian state, which was the German radio. The Germans had prime time nailed in a way that Americans never got to. They forced people to listen to the radio every day. The Germans in the 30s. Not today. You were forced to listen to the radio for 2 hours a day to hear the words of the nation's leaders. That was the invention of prime time in totalitarian regimes, to forge a single nation that wanted one thing. And we had the same thing in America. It was just for something different, to forge us on to a people who wanted to buy stuff. Entertainment that sells. Finally, it is crucially important, and was the case for most of the 20th century, that the government preferred monopolies. AT&T was protected by law from competition. It was seen by the Defense Department as so important to national defense that the company could never be broken up. Now, all of this may sound sort of like ancient history. It may sound like things that happened in the 30s. We're different now. We have the internet. We all have cell phones. We're smarter, better looking people than we were 100 years ago. You might think this is ancient history, but I will tell you the same patterns, the same strategies power each of the information empires of our time. The open internet is, of course, the disruptive new technology in our time. And if you look carefully, the power of integration is still being used, and in fact is what powers Apple computers in particular. This is Steve Jobs. He's talking about the Apple TV, and what he says is, what Americans want more than anything is Hollywood products. They don't want amateur hour. They just want Hollywood products. They want an integrated solution that gives them what they want. They want the convenience of our products tied with the best content, and that's it. Network effects, which I discussed in the context of the Bell telephone, are relied on by most of the most powerful information companies of our age, but you can see this very clearly in Facebook's triumph over MySpace. Everyone knows that the reason that Facebook is useful is because everyone uses it. That's what makes it useful, and it creates the natural conditions for monopoly. Not saying it's a bad thing, I'm just saying that's what happens. Economies of scale, which seem like John Rockefeller economics, are very much still the dominant issue in information industries. Google, which might seem to have no advantage in the sense that you could go to any search engine if you really wanted, Google's power resides in its back end, in its aggregation of massive numbers of servers, massive numbers of computers to create a search engine that's much better than anyone else's. Google takes advantage of the same strategies that the Standard Oil Company and AT&T took advantage of to maintain its power. And finally, people today are really no different than before. The motivations to own an information company remain what they once were. And in fact, when you imagine that we are now in the age of a single universal network, the potential power of controlling or having some influence over that one great network is perhaps even greater than it was before. As Eric Schmidt saying, the one person I really admire is Machiavelli. Here's another familiar figure. The head of Facebook. So I want to, and today we still have a federal government which is not what it was once. We once had a federal government whose idea of an ideal industry was one that was monopolized, run by good men, who we could trust to do the best for the nation. But we still, in areas like spectrum policy, that is the airways, we still guarantee that some of the largest and most well-known companies, Verizon, which is formerly part of AT&T, continue to win, continue to dominate these markets. I want to turn last to what this says about us. There is a contradiction or a paradox in the American soul and maybe the human condition. On the one hand, Americans aspire, and maybe everyone aspires, to values like freedom, choice, openness, free speech. They want to choose what they watch, what you see, what influences you. But at the same time, Americans and the rest of the world, we have a powerful taste for reliability, for things being of a certain quality, for ease of use, and above all, convenience. Who here doesn't use nearly every day one of Google or Amazon, Twitter, Skype, Apple, or eBay? And the reason is they're just more convenient. But when we do that, ironically, by choosing the more convenient option, we always end up limiting our choices. So there is a paradox, and there is a need for us to realize that if we want choice, and if we want openness, we have to create it. It doesn't happen by itself. And we have to understand, finally, that it is us, we, who create information monopolies. Thank you very much.